Thank you, Bronwyn, for joining us today. I know that you are a futurist and economist. I have had the pleasure of reading some of your books, most recently Navigating the Metaverse, that you were featured in there as well. There was a quote that stood out to me that you stated when they asked you about the greater opportunity of the metaverse. And one of the things you said was that all we know is that if you are not part of building it, you don't have a vote on where we end up. So I wanted to kind of start with that beautiful quote because I think the metaverse is really about that. So before we jump too deep into the metaverse, just give us a little bit about your backstory. What's your journey been like to get here?
Sure. So my educational background is somewhat checkered. I've got degrees in everything from marketing and theology all the way through to foresight and economics. But it's somewhere in the center of that very messy diagram. It's all about trying to understand meaning and value and what makes us do the things that we do, essentially, as human beings. And some of that value is intrinsic, some of it's more extrinsic. And depending on the different sort of roles that I've had in the different organizations that I've been with, I've sort of focused on different areas of that sort of quest for understanding value and how to optimize and maximize it. So for around about the last sort of 10 years, I've been working in the consulting space, looking quite a lot at fintech trends, obviously, because I've got an economics background, and trying to unpack the direction of the world of value and money, and also the technology underpinning that for corporates across the world, to get them to understand with a view but beyond sort of classic macroeconomics as to where the future of money and value is heading. But during COVID, like most of us, we took on extra projects. The first project that I took on was with my now current business partner, 𝗵𝗺𝗶𝗴𝗶. We put together a book called The Future Starts Now, and we got to talk to all sorts of interesting people all across the world. But as these things do, they evolve. And from that, we got involved. We found ourselves sort of suddenly funded to create quite an ambitious video game. And from that, we evolved and pivoted once again into doing what we're doing right now at Metanomic, which is again focusing on that quest towards understanding value and meaning in the increasingly virtualized, digitized worlds that we have right now in terms of both time and attention and money. And we started building a suite of products that are helping businesses, once again, to measure, monetize, and optimize that very vacuous equation of value in the metaverse. And value, of course, when you think about it, whether you're talking about the real world or the metaverse, value is generally centered around scarcity. So in the real world, that scarcity is quite finite. It's easy for us to understand. You've got like a finite amount of energy. We all have energy crunch right now, so you know about that. It's a finite amount of toilet paper on the shelves during COVID, right? So if you go in there and buy too much, there's going to be none left behind. So that becomes more valuable, so you can increase the price. So real value and real scarcity is, I think, something we intuitively understand. What we don't necessarily understand so well is that the same principles are playing out now in the virtualized metaverse type and Web3 economies, in that the value is still centered around scarcity. Some of that scarcity has come from artificial scarcity and the likes of Bitcoin, and trying to sort of impose artificial limits on the amount of a currency that can be produced in order to try and give it value, or on putting artificial scarcity in the amounts of unreal estate that can be released. But unlike real estate in the real world, of which there is a finite supply on Earth, and there's a finite supply of beach property, there's no real constraint to the quantity of the imaginary assets, whether they are currencies or whether they are goods like a decentralized land or a sandbox sort of virtual properties. There's no limits to that. So there's no real scarcity there. And we can con ourselves into thinking that the value comes because we've imposed these artificial limits onto how much of this stuff is available. But it's absolutely not true, because it just takes our consensus to change that supply. And there's some more, unlike with the real world, where with all the will in the world and all the consensus and voting we have, we're not going to vote our way into getting a SIG in California, right? It's just going to only be one. So what really underpins the real value there is actually the scarcity of human attention. So it's where people are looking, how they are engaged, how they are participating, and what they want. So it's actually becomes quite a psychological and, again, a meaning-related question that's propping up the value of what's going on in the metaverse. And that's why what we're doing in our business is not only are we trying to price and measure those sort of virtual assets, we're also trying to help people to understand where that attention is going and what sorts of people are wanting and looking for what sorts of things, because that's where the real value is coming from. It's very human, as much as we tend to think about the future and the metaverse as being quite inhuman. Quite frankly, all the value is coming from people, what we want.
I love that. Yeah, and often I feel like to have the forward-thinking mindset of understanding the metaverse, you have to unlearn a few things because it's hard for you to have an elevated mindset. I think for most people and companies who are trying to understand it, and maybe even traditional economists to try to understand it. So this is really interesting to have your perspective because I feel like we focus a lot on trying to get people to have that elevated mindset and to shift their thinking and realizing that the metaverse really isn't something so far away. It isn't something so digital and separate from our current lives. We just have to kind of rethink the way that we engage with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very human. This is a human. It's created by humans for humans, so we should be able to understand it. In fact, we should be able to understand it better than our emergent economies in the real world, which are an emergent property, like chaotic systems. You have this sort of sense that tries to emerge from it. An economist's role in the real world is to try and make sense about what has emerged naturally, whereas the problem the metaverse space should be a lot simpler because it's all been designed by humans. So the chaos is at least limited to what we have built and created ourselves. So it is actually understandable. We've done a very bad job of understanding it because we're not properly tracking where those value chains are coming from. We're not properly tracking how people are behaving in that space. And I use tracking as probably quite a bad word. It has a lot of sort of surveillance connotations to it. But I'm talking more about understanding how the systems flow and how the value is shifting across these things. It is much more understandable, quite frankly, in the metaverse for those who care to try and understand it, as opposed to our real world systems, which not even the best central bankers in the world can really keep control of, as we all know now.
Yeah, right, like data collection. But that would be something that I think it's important for us to start seeing the process of where we've been from just a year ago to now. And that kind of, again, that elevated mindset thinking of how we kind of evolve the metaverse in the future and what is the metaverse of the future. I think that's like we're stuck with this Web 3.0, and there's so many different things, but we've been hearing even like in the socials, people talking about Web 5, Web 2.5. I think all of that is like, it doesn't really matter. I think it's really focusing on where the future lies. So it is said that the metaverse creates limitless opportunities. What kinds of opportunities do you see Web3 and the metaverse space in the next 5 years?
Yeah, the sorts of opportunities we're really going to see there are the next evolution. So at the moment, what we've kind of seen there is sort of a replication of real world business models taking place in the metaverse. And they've kind of been flattened and actually made quite a little bit more silly. I mean, like for a while, we were all excited about digital versions of the physical sneakers that we wore. But that excitement's going to wear off quite quickly because it is quite gimmicky. It's innovation, not real innovation. And it's only exciting because people are excited about it, quite frankly. So there's nothing really supporting that underneath. But the next sort of phase is where we're going to start to see the more real value sort of systems being built upon it. And again, that's only able to evolve when we start to understand why it is that people are attracted to these spaces, why it is people are attracted to things like digital fashion, why it is people are congregating in certain social media platforms or in certain gaming environments increasingly going forward. Once we understand why people are going to these places and what they're actually looking for, the deeper meaning. It's quite easy to say they're there to watch the concert or they're there to buy the shoe or they're there for the latest airdrop. But why are they really there? Are they there to connect with other people? Are they there to try and improve their social status? Are they playing? What sort of games are people playing? And once we understand what people are really looking for, we can create those sort of better games around them. And I talk about games quite loosely. I'm not talking about like actual video games only. I'm also talking about the economic games that we play every day. I mean, it's all made up. Like our whole economy is made up. It's a game we choose to play together. And it's hard to opt out of it sometimes, but the game only works because we participate in it, right? And we'll figure out how to build games that people actually want to play, and not just games that are replicated, games that are actually using the new technologies in new ways. And like I could actually speak to quite some offline examples there as to how we start to see a technology that was designed by a platform or a developer in quite a specific way ends up being used for something that nobody even really thought about, and it collides with the real world in quite interesting ways. And I'm going to take it away from the metaverse and towards Africa, where I live. And what happened with e-commerce during COVID? Because obviously, like if you live in a rural area or in a township or an informal settlement where you don't have like reliable electricity, you're unlikely to be able to download like Uber Eats, let alone afford the sort of fees that they're going to have to drive those goods and services to your door. However, they have the same needs just because you can't afford to use the same services as someone in a much more affluent area. And instead we see very simple technologies like WhatsApp or SMS being actually used by sort of grassroots sort of on the ground entrepreneurs to actually start building e-commerce networks with vast amounts of scale. So you see a piece of technology that was designed for one thing is solving a need in quite a different area because it's actually solving a real need. And what we haven't seen much of in the metaverse yet is the solving of real needs. And the real needs are being met. That's why there is value and there is attention there, but they're being met indirectly. And it's the sort of needs for connection that we have right now. Like our needs for connection are being solved in quite bad ways, through games that are designed to entertain, for example, or social media platforms that are designed to disseminate news. But we haven't necessarily figured out how to solve the need of connection directly. And that's when we're going to start seeing more interesting things come out in the metaverse, which won't be as shiny as we think about. So we tend to think about it as being all VR and very, very, blue and pink, very white robots, all of that sort of stuff. But the real changes actually come from the social movements. So we saw that with Web 2 too, right? I mean, like it started out social networks and are so ubiquitous, but that wasn't what we thought we were going to get when we were going to get the internet. That wasn't the plan. And yet that's the key thing that sort of evolved out of the last version of the web. So we'll see what comes next, but it's going to be social. It's going to be human-based, which I think will disappoint a lot of keynote speakers who like to show pictures of shiny things.
Absolutely. And I think that pandemic created like a giant social experiment, right? Because everything changed so fast and the adoption of technology really like sped up. So those who maybe weren't using it, businesses, and I live in Florida, I live in Miami, and it's like a pretty fast moving city for the most part. From that to where we are today, now it's been, I can't even believe it. I think it's like 2 years now since like we were in the pandemic hot seat, and things are much more open. People are trying to figure out how to leverage this new technology, trying to understand what Web3 is. And I find that often we're again in this social, psychological experiment of trying to understand how to use it to solve problems. We've moved through the entry phase where everything was NFTs and that's all people talked about. And I think that when you consider why that was like the most important thing, it's easy for people to understand. Buying an image, getting something for it, selling it, reselling it, the very simple concept of like NFTs as PFPs. Now that people understand that, obviously there was a crash and burn. Everybody knows that would happen. It wasn't a sustainable model long term. Now enter the people that are truly trying to build social good or trying to leverage the technology for social good. So in your opinion, how could the metaverse impact the lives, the world, and the future of technology?
I think that probably the exciting thing we see there is the leveling of the playing field and connecting of the developing versus developed worlds. And I know you use those terms with hesitation because people get sort of all up in arms about any of those phrases, but we have to have some sort of language. It's not a new thing. It's more of an evolution. It's not a complete new phase, not a switch that we're going into. Something I get quite frustrated about, this whole idea of even Web 2 and Web 3 as being some sort of evolutionary step can get quite confusing for people. But what we are seeing is that it is connecting people in a borderless way a lot more than prior before. So Bitcoin, of course, was the early example of that, right? It's a borderless private currency. It's not controlled by geography. So this idea of sort of disintermediating geography and allowing people to connect more with each other is something that we have seen before, but and you spoke about it. You spoke about the likes of Zoom and Teams and all those dreadful platforms, like the ones we're using right now, are now connecting us on various different parts of the world in a much more seamless way. So you start with like the telephone and the ships and all the rest of it, and slowly the world is becoming more connected and geography becomes less of an obstacle. So we don't have to worry so much about things like migration. And this affects politics, it affects economics, it affects competition. It means that the best of the world are competing against the best of the world, not just the best of whatever pond you happen to be born into or flop into when you sort of arrive in this world. So the metaverse opens up the next level of that. It makes even more seamless and even more globalized on that sort of abstracted level, on an economic and on a political sense, not on a sort of reality privilege sense in terms of our actual quality of real life, but more in terms of competition, money, markets, and the speed and the way that things move. So there's an accessibility component there, but there's also a bit of a mirage in that real inequality left back at home sort of remains the same, even if the metaverse itself is a much more equitable place to play in, which is quite an interesting idea to play with. So I think the sort of political and economic implications are probably more interesting than the technological and business ones over there. But there is this idea that throughout human society, we have been moving towards more connectivity and more globalization and more ease of sharing of information and energy. And that's definitely something we're going to continue seeing here as the next step phase. But I do want to go back to that idea of the distinction between these various steps of like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, and these terms that are thrown around. Metaverse is another one. They're terrible concepts because they mean everything and nothing. They mean whatever whoever is speaking to about. But I think that the change that we're seeing right now and why people feel it is a step change is that it has been a couple of key tipping points that took place during COVID. The first tipping point was the technology right up until 2020 was something that was a privilege of the wealthy nations and wealthy people in society. And a lack of access to technology was a symptom of poverty and disconnection, right? But what's happening at the moment right now is that we're actually seeing that pendulum switch, much like what happened with mass manufactured China, like, talking about like cups and pottery, like back in the pre-Victorian era, when they started having mass manufactured goods, they were perfect. And the rich were the ones who purchased the nice, new, perfect machine-made china to serve on their tables. And the poor made do with like artisanal stuff, right? But somewhere along the line in the 20th, 21st century, that flips around, right? So now artisanal handmade products with the human touch and our privilege of the rich and like the poor make do with the mass manufactured goods. And this was a tipping point that took place that kind of switched the difference between like the industrial era and moving towards the knowledge economy. So we kind of had another one of those tipping points now where access to digital technology, which was previously a privilege of the rich, is now becoming actually almost a tool of the masses, and wealthier people are moving more towards personal human contact. Again, this idea of human attention being the only source of real value in the metaverse is something to watch if you care about things like inequality and social shifts. It's all part of the same conversation. This idea of humans, individual humans, the human touch, real people, the ability to connect with people all across the world is almost becoming like not necessarily a privilege, but more like or even a right, but more like a responsibility of the masses. So it's something you have to participate in. So technology almost becomes the opposite. It becomes a symbol of, or having to use this sort of technology all the time in order to survive, having to participate in games like 𝗀𝗄𝗃cie Infinity, having to earn a digital living rather than a real living becomes a symptom of poverty rather than actually a symptom of wealth. So that's quite an interesting sort of tipping point that we've seen right now during COVID, and it's taking place right now. We see it across all strata, across schooling, how previously wealthy schools had iPads and poor schools didn't, and now suddenly poor schools are all done online and wealthy parents are hiring 𝗊𝗶𝗄𝗃 again, like we're back to the Victorian era. And we see these examples everywhere, the switch towards the metaverse actually being for the masses. I mean, like Mark Andreessen's reality privilege was exactly about that, right? Not everyone can live a nice life like me and have a nice car and be actually warm and wealthy, but everyone can pretend to live my life in the metaverse, right? Like the metaverse is for the masses, not for the elite. And that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. But there's a second tipping point that's taking place right now, which is why people feel there's a bit of a step change. And it's not a technological step change. Again, it's a step change in terms of how we are using the digital technologies that we have. And up until now, digital technologies, talking about internet connectivity, which sort of started in the 70s and evolved through social media and all the rest of it, has been on a kind of a one-way direction journey of actually increasing access and decreasing cost of access to goods and services. I mean, like internet started out, like computers were really expensive. They were only available in like universities and all the rest of it, right? And then over time, they became cheaper and access to information became free. Web 2, or the web up until now, was all about digital abundance. It was about reducing or using economies of scale to drive costs down to zero, which is why we're able to access things like Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and all the rest of it for free, right? I mean, this is actually amazing value that was given to us essentially for free. Everything got cheaper. The big tech companies using their economies of scale mean that we're buying clothes and goods and consumer goods in the wealthy world, often for less than cost, right? Like we took out all the middlemen. It was all about reducing costs and increasing access. It was about digital abundance. It was about artificial, effectively, abundance. Whereas Web 3 is a pivot point. So we've stopped increasing access to goods and decreasing costs, and we're now doing the opposite. This is why people are feeling that something is shifted. And suddenly Web 3 is becoming the internet of recommoditizing the digital commons, which was decommoditized right up until around about 2020. And it's something we're only grappling with now. And the phase of the internet we're going into now is a collision of two worlds, the very centralized platformified world of Meta and Facebook and all the big gaming companies, the Fortnites, the Epic Games of the world, these big platformified metaverse experiences controlled effectively by private entities, like private digital communities that are, we get to play in and pay to play in. And on the other hand, we've also got the rise of DeFi, of course, the world of crypto and decentralization. And they're very different worldviews, philosophically speaking, but what they have in common is they are both about artificial scarcity. They're both about pricing what was previously free and about adding a value to things that were previously exchanged without a price tag. It's about commoditizing everything. It's about a world of micropayments. It's a world, instead of having access to free recipes on a blog post, it's instead being charged a fraction of a gas fee on an Ethereum transaction in order to read that post or to listen to a piece of music. It's a world where people are being forced to sell things that previously they would have given away for free, whereas the previous phase was about kind of being forced to give things away, the freemium world, in order to try and get people to see that you have value further down the line. It's quite a big shift. And it's a shift that can be seen kind of as sort of hyper-capitalization that's happening. So it's about pricing everything. And not necessarily everything should have a price in the human world, but we like to do that. It's like capitalism seems to move in kind of that direction, right? Because it's efficient. But it's a game where we all have to pay to play and pay to win, right? It's a game of survival of the fittest, and it's a game increasingly, like I said, with that other tipping point, that the more privileged are less compelled to play, and the less privileged are more compelled to play. So we've seen the rise of things like play to earn gaming. So you used to pay money for fun, right? So you'd like pay money because you're getting an experience. Now you're forced to do this sort of non-work work, this valueless work, in order to justify or earn your credits in order to participate in this virtual economy. It's quite an incredible space to be in. It's like those two pivot points are pointing towards an interesting next phase of the future, which is likely to last for several decades, quite frankly, if you look at the way these sort of cycles play out, the recommoditization phase. So it's basically like what happened when the sort of settlers arrived on the shores of the various different continents from Europe. And what was free land was sort of divided up into parcels. It was commoditized, it was priced, and it was turned into a commodity that we can trade and start to build value on. On the one hand, that's great. We're building value, we're creating value, there's a lot of velocity in the system. On the other hand, it means that there's less and less sort of free spaces and common spaces. So that's what's happening at this phase of the internet. It's like the colonization of the internet is taking place. The colonists are not this time a geographic group. Again, geography has kind of gone off the picture. It's rather the first explorers that are kind of getting there and carving it out and deciding what is going to be priced and what is going to be traded, right? And that's why I say, if you don't sort of like the way these things are headed, you do get a vote. That's the good thing of decentralized systems. You get a vote and you're incentivized to vote. You're incentivized to participate. But very much the world we're going to build, and it's an entirely human-based world that we're going to build, is going to be dependent on how we vote with our time and with our money. And that's what we're trying to measure and monitor, and you sort of find out how it works with the work that we're doing at Metanomic. We're trying to see where that value is coming from, the intrinsic and the extrinsic, where people's attention is going, where they're spending their time and where they're spending their money, and where they're expecting to get paid for their time, get paid for like doing the work on the other hand. So it's a very interesting space to be in. I think that sociologists and economists of the future will have great fun looking at this, but I don't think there's many people talking about those two key tipping points that we're at. And that's why we're feeling this sort of sense of losing our equilibrium, because all the equations we've built our businesses and our lives around have been flipped over or in the process of flipping, kind of like those magnetic poles on the earth, right? Like that's where we are right now.
And I think we constantly think we're going up like this, but really it's all just waves, right? Like decentralized, centralized, and then it goes back to centralized and decentralized. So we're in these constant waves. And I was hearing you, and it made me think, for me, understanding the metaverse is an opportunity. So I'm from Cuba, and in my country is also pretty impoverished in the sense that they don't have access to internet like we do here in America. It's an absolute pleasure to go and Google whatever you want and like get to go on the socials and do whatever you want. And even though we want to shy back from it, they're trying to jump into it to create opportunity. Obviously, they're filtered, so they can't necessarily do that. So what I'm excited to see is those kind of government decisions or those like kind of break, in the sense that now there are other ways in which they can access this technology. So I'm really excited for that, because that will create opportunity where there isn't another way to really make money for them right now. They don't really have a lot of options. There's not a lot of food. They can't.
Open space, it's the new frontier. There's plenty of new terrain in the metaverse.
Yeah, it's so exciting. So I think that that's what keeps me moving forward, is understanding that there's so much potential to break through some of the norms, to give people access that don't have access, like you said, cross-border communication. That's how I've actually been able to communicate with my family. When I moved to this country, I was about 4 years old. And at that time, it was it still is today, to make a phone call to Cuba. It's very, very expensive. And so they have to get access to only that line. And with time, over the past few years, now they have access to what they get, kind of like calling cards, where they get access to internet, and they only turn it on. They turn it on and turn it off, which is interesting, turning it on, turning it off. But once they have that connection, then they could reach you. And now they communicate through WhatsApp, an application that didn't exist before. They also communicate through Facebook Messenger. And that's how we talk to each other more regularly, because it's easier. It's not necessarily, it's cheaper than calling. So that's another advance. And it's so funny when you can take a step back and you look at the bigger picture and you see how slow it moves for other people in other countries. And then you come here and we're talking about these robots, designs, and things. And then we're how do we get this technology in other countries so that they can use it? Well, this was super exciting. I love this conversation with you. Thank you so much. Let's close it with one last question. What is the legacy you would like to create?
I would like to create a legacy where more people exercise their agency and exercise their votes, and are very conscious about the fact that we do have lots of votes. You might only get to vote once in your election cycle, if you're even lucky enough to live in a democratic society. But you get to vote every day in terms of your time and in terms of your attention. And companies, corporations, entities are watching how you spend your time and how you spend your attention, and they're giving you more of what you want. So think about where you are looking, what you are doing, the businesses you're supporting, as being a vote for what you want more of. And try think sort of consciously about that. And I really like people to think about that as you move into the metaverse, where everything, in the Web3 space in particular, where everything is so commoditized, where those votes really do matter. And because they're all digitized, they're all tracked, they are all seen, and you will get more of what you vote for. So think quite carefully about that agency there. You probably got more of it than you might have thought that you did.
Oh, I love that. That's that being conscious in your kind of everyday involvement. I love that. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. It was a pleasure to connect with you. I appreciate your time. We'll be engaging also through the Women of the Future project and the book. It was an honor to have you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.